thank you so much. Um, so first off, Ani, bonjour, mashki kedemi koyin dishnakas, miziki indodem, Six Nations, misagi hindunjaba. So as Julian has already done a little introduction for me, I am the lead artist for this project. And what we're going to do today is take a bit of time to outline what the project is, how we're going to be moving forward. And I'm also going to just kind of really help to ground and create a foundation for this time that we're going to share together in this learning space. So I'm going to take the time now to share my screen. And I'm also going to turn my camera off because I am speaking from Six Nations area, and the internet is somewhat unreliable at times. So I'm going to turn my camera off here. Share here. And please do forgive me. I am just recovering from a sinus infection. So I am a little, sometimes I have to take a break and mute to cough and things like that. So, but thank you for having the patience with me. So as I mentioned, welcome. This is the first in the introduction session for the Art Connects iTalks happening with Northbrook Arts. And where I really wanted to start, and I think it was really great, and I definitely appreciate the opening with the land acknowledgement, and we will get to that eventually. We're going to take a bit of a deeper dive into why we do these things as part of the process of taking steps moving forward into reconciliation spaces and beginning to have some of these conversations. But what I really wanted to take the time to always begin with whenever we're opening up space is to open it in a good way. And Julian has already done that as well by offering the tobacco. And that's actually what I have back here in this background is the tobacco plant. It's one of the first medicines that was given to us from creation for many, many, many reasons. But primarily what in terms of my teachings has been for us to remember our connection and to help us within our relationship to not only each other, but also to the land and to creation at large and spirit. So with that, one of the things that, people may notice from our communities is, we often, depending again, nation to nation is very different, has different teachings, but especially in this area, you'll find it a lot, the passing of tobacco as a gift, or even for a speaker, or what has just happened here, us opening the space. And really what I wanted to take the time to talk about in relation to that is this idea of relationships first. And that is essentially, in a nutshell, what this project has formed into. For myself, being involved in the beginning ideation phase of what this was going to shape up to be for Northbrook Arts, and then the continuation of some consultation work that had been done around, moving into these different spaces and collaborating with Indigenous artists and communities and knowledge keepers and how to go about that work. So the first thing is always around developing relationship. And one of the best ways that I know how to do that, and what I've been taught, is to be able to open the space and share a little bit. And one of the ways in our communities that we do these things is by asking another, who are you? What's your nation? Where do you come from? Who claims you, right? What land base are you connected to? So when we do our openings and we do our introductions, that's really what we're trying to get at, right? Is to understand what your relationship is to your people, to the land that you come from. What's your relationship and what kind of skills do you bring? So I wanted to take the time for, to open it up and to allow everybody to get to know who I am. Why am I the one who's leading this project and having some of these conversations? So as Julian had mentioned, my traditional name was given to me over 15 years now. I've been sitting and getting to know my name, and I identify both as Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe. I have both nations running in my bloodlines, and so I've been very fortunate to have been welcomed by, both nations of people, um, and different communities as well. And so I was given this name, and it's pronounced. And Julian, you did a really good job. Actually, it was a very good pronunciation. So
Thank you.
hats
I
off to
did my
you.
best. Thank
Yes.
you.
So Meshkeke Nebe. And what I wanted to do is just kind of break that down for you, because within that, it's actually it's giving a lot of information, um, as in terms of how we relate to one another and how we would relate in community, and kind of giving some indication as to what kind of skill sets I bring to the table and what responsibilities are unique to me, in my own print and my own walk on the earth. So Meshkeke, loosely translated, to medicine, um, and maybe more specific, the strength of the earth, right? If you think about the medicines, as I was mentioning, as gifts, some of the first gifts that were given to us, there's a strength that's indicative of that relationship and that connection. So there's the piece in there, and then also with nebe, translating to water. So those together, medicine, water, it can mean a lot of different things, but medicine in general is, one of those components of community, um, that really work to support people, and support community, and that can be in many different ways. And there's all different types of medicine. So for me, as a name, as a traditional name, being that that's how essentially our traditional names are how creation identifies us. That's what creation calls us. So that's what I've come here on this earth walk with. And I, even myself, I'm still learning what that is. I have a pretty good idea now, having sat with that name for as long as I have, but I continue to keep learning. And that's one of the beautiful parts about these processes is that, and in my teachings that I've been given from healers and elders that I've been able to sit with over the years, is that we're always constantly learning. We're always students, and that learning process should never end. So it's a really beautiful process that we're even going through in opening this space and going on this journey together. So the other part here, breaking down my nations. So as I mentioned, I identify as Anishinaabe Haudenosaunee. Anguahonwe is another name for Haudenosaunee people, and that comprises the Six Nations, which is the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Tuscarora, the Seneca, the Cayuga. I actually have been doing some more digging of my family history, and it's very interesting. I even have, on my father's side, I have Seneca ancestors, and my grandmother Seneca, and then I also have Cayuga ancestors, and so it's really been really interesting, and Onondaga. So it's really interesting to kind of see how, and really piece together the history of how long, my ancestors have been in this area and where we've moved around from. And then also I mentioned on the Anishinaabe side, the Ojibwe, the Mississaugas. So basically, loosely again, there's many different translations, and it's really depending on dialect and who you're speaking to, what language speakers you're talking to, but loosely translating to the many river mouths. And a lot of times, the Mississaugas particularly connected to Credit River, and then there's a whole history that's related to that, which we will actually get to talk about in this series, which is super exciting. And then the other piece here is my clan. So a lot of Indigenous peoples carry clans, and a clan system, which is a very intricate system to serve many purposes. But one of the key purposes is to let other community members know who is family, who you're related to. So other turtle clans kind of are in your clan family. But also more in depth in the sense is what you're bringing to the circle. So I've done some digging and just kind of over time listening to and asking questions about my clan and getting to know my other clan members. There's some commonalities that are involved in there, and a lot of indications of this based in storytelling and our traditional stories and ceremonies and all of those things. So some of the things that I've been told and taught of is, having a particular connection to the shifting of the earth, changes and cycles of the moon, really being known as the information keepers, keepers of the land. Again, being able to have that connection to not only land but also water, being very having traits of being very methodical, cautious, having longevity, being resilient and adaptable, protected because of the shell. Turtles carry a shell they carry their home on their back. So they're always kind of carrying that sense of groundedness with them that they can kind of rely on to add to their resiliency. And the last one always cracks me up because it's not liking to be rushed. For me personally, it's funny because over time, I think I've changed as I've gotten older, but I was used to be very impatient. And it's funny because I also simultaneously did not like to get rushed. So I think that that's a lesson I'm learning as I'm getting older, is to, have some balance when it comes to that piece. And then here, in terms of the pictures, I have a little picture. There's little me looking really cool with the sunglasses. And I also have a picture of my late grandmother, Lauren LaForme. She was known as Babe in the community. And I just really love this picture. It's one of my favorite pictures of her. And especially, again, because of the connection to water, and also just that representation and that honoring of my matrilineal line. A lot of nations, it depends on who you're talking to. Some nations follow the father's line, some nations follow the mother's line. But I've always had a really special connection to her. So I just wanted to bring that energy to the space, and, because that's a really big piece of kind of creating, who I am today. And then also I decided to bring in and share some of my work. And then this is a painting I had done that was created after my first fasting ceremony, when I went to go on fast with my name. So again, naturally, I was placed by a creek and was able to spend some time with the water and getting acquainted with the land and the water in that way. And this is just a little homage piece to that beginning part of my journey, and launching the cycle of starting to, get to where I am today, to start talking about and going into spaces around working on reconciliation and the arts and community arts and all of those kinds of pieces. So as I was talking, this is just a visual representation of some history of kind of where I am at and rooted in place right now. And so currently I'm speaking to you from Six Nations of the Grand River, which is also directly beside Mississaugas of Credit First Nation. So I'm actually very much close to the land and surrounded by family, reintegrated back into my community. I actually had gone to Toronto to go to OCAD-U. So I'm an OCAD-U graduate, and I had lived in Toronto for 15 plus years up until the pandemic happened, and came back to, contribute to the homestead and work remotely out of here. But I still do a lot of work and still very connected to the Toronto community in a lot of different projects in different ways. But I really wanted to take the time to, give some insight into kind of the journey of how I've found myself here, and how I can, and why I'm contributing to this conversation. So I went to, like I mentioned, I went to OCAD-U, and my whole plan originally when I set out was my end goal was to be an art therapist. So I actually really wanted to work with our community members in a combination of social work and arts. And because I've always been an artist, I was a creator since I was really little. And I also was always around social services. So I actually spent a lot of my younger years in joining my mom at work in addictions and mental health services. So I spent a lot of time, with community members that were in quite a bit of pain and going through some things. And when you're a kid, you don't really understand that. You just see them as people, and, you're just having fun. And, I was able to have that experience, but I do think it definitely shaped kind of what I do now. It makes a lot of sense. So I decided to go and do my undergrad and go to OCAD. And my whole plan was I'm going to go do the art thing first, because that was like the hip thing, and I wanted to do it while I was young. So that's what I decided to do first. And then I eventually ended up just placed, in creators' hands around going where I needed to be and just really trusting that process. And I actually ended up in social services anyway, um, regardless of, the being involved in the arts. So it kind of was a parallel simultaneously happening. So I did a lot of governance work when I was in my undergrad and joined the Indigenous Education Council and helped to played a part in creating the Indigenous Visual Culture program that's now at OCADU and is a graduate program. And I also was part of the, at the time was the Aboriginal Students Association, so I was the president of there. And then I was also working at an Indigenous arts org while I was going to school. So I was doing lots of things. And that led me to join Native Child and Family Services of Toronto. So I actually went into developing programming, arts programming, supportive programming for at-risk youth involved in the child welfare system. And then I also did some work with alternative education as well for Indigenous youth. And then that time there really is where I started to take in more specialized training around frontline working and trauma-informed practices and pieces like that. So really starting to dive into more the program development side. But of course, when you're involved in social services, you kind of end up doing frontline work eventually. So I did that. And then from there, I did a few other gigs and primarily, and then eventually found myself in social services supporting Indigenous women that have been involved in and dealing with exploitation and different forms of trauma. So I actually eventually became a manager of a trauma team and started to deal in doing some specialized training specifically to do with combating human trafficking and exploitation, and then the gang involvement. So that's what I actually do as a day job, I suppose. But I don't really see it that way. I see this as, all of those pieces are contributing to a bigger picture, right, of moving our communities along, and advocacy work kind of doesn't, for me at least, doesn't end in one space. It's a very intersectional thing. So I kind of see them as interlinked, and all the while still doing the arts, community arts pieces, being a practicing artist on my own, and really weaving and combining those things. So all this is to say, why is that important to what we're going to be talking about in this project and to this type of work? Again, like I mentioned, there's a very layered nature to, all of these interconnections. They're all relying on one another, and they're all linked together. So for me, that's where I bring a very unique perspective to the arts, and that is also seen in a lot of the, I suppose, extracurricular things I do, as far as bringing my expertise to different boards. So I do some work with Steps Public Art as an Indigenous advisor, and I also do some work with Toronto Arts Council. So it's really, really diving into the space of reconciliation arts and what that means, and how do we create programs that are very meaningful and intentional and successful in the sense of really getting the information to people in a good way. So that's really in a nutshell, like how my art is interconnected with my advocacy, interconnected with my social work, interconnected with my own practice. And you can kind of see that from some of the works that I'm sharing with you. This is a piece that I had done called Dibwe, which was for the Red Embers project that was installed in Allen Gardens, Toronto, as part of the Sisters in Spirit Remembrance Days in 2019. And then also some work I had done around, Indigenous women's roles in land and ecological issues, as seen here in the We Honor Our Mother the Earth. And then today, I am now the community safety liaison for the Ontario Native Women's Association, and I've put in here the Grandmother Earth dress that's really the anchor of our programming and what kind of the department of where I am at in terms of advocacy for Indigenous women's issues specifically. So that's kind of me in nutshell. Other, things to get to know me, um, is, as much as all of these things are really important, the other part of it too that I think sometimes people don't see is the individuality, the individual that comes to these spaces and comes to this work. So myself, I am, I have residential school survivors in my family, survivors of day schools. Um, so I'm not going to go into details of that because that's to protect, that's their stories, right? However, I recognize and honor the the intergenerational nature of some of these patterns. So I myself have, had to battle with, depression, anxiety. Anxiety is something I still really struggle with today. And also in my younger years, before I started getting on this pathway to start, walking in a good way, getting back to ceremony, starting to rediscover who I am in relation to my nation and my clan. I was very much heavily involved in drug usage, so I actually have, having had to go to counseling and do that healing work on my own things to get me to this place. And I don't think that there's reasons why people don't talk about those things, and we're going to get into that when we get along into this process. But I wanted to be upfront and share that with you so that you understand a bit more of kind of where I'm rooted within this process and how this stance and that path contributes to this conversation with you all. So, what we're kind of talking about here is we're really going to take an exploration of our connection to the land base. But before that ever happens, it's really, again, like I mentioned at the beginning, about the relationship building, and that's really what this program is going to be doing. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because we did do the land acknowledgement, which I think is great, and we should be continuing to do these things. But what I'm really hoping in this program is that we start to question, okay, we're doing a land acknowledgement. Yes, we understand that North York is situated in Treaty 13 within Toronto. It has this connection for many different nations, as it's outlined here. The traditional territory of the current title holders, Mississaugas of Credit First Nation, but also have a history with the Anishinaabeg, Anishinaabe, Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, many people, and then also understanding that in a contemporary sense, there's so many other nations that now call Toronto home. There's a huge increase in the Inuit population that's happening in the city, as well as the Métis Nation. So this is just something that's continuing to expand and get, more people are coming to the city. And of course, that makes sense in terms of it being a melting pot. But also, if we look at the traditional symbols and we look at the land base, a lot of nations converged in that area for a lot of different reasons, and primarily the proximity of the waterways, the watersheds, all in connection and direction to the lake. So there's a lot of history there around, why nations and peoples have congregated in the area for so long. But that's kind of something that we're going to explore in this. But even deeper than that, something that I'm always getting people to think about is, yes, it's great to do the land acknowledgement, but why do we do it? What's the importance? Because I think that, this is not necessarily a new conversation in that we've been talking about this for some years now. And I've found over time, it was a big push to get the acknowledgement, but now we have to do better. We have to do better and better every time, to really start to understand, really get to the deep grit of like, why do we do these things? Why is it so important? And I think for individuals looking to understand reconciliation, it also has to be personable, right? I know what a land acknowledgement is to me as an Indigenous person, residing in different areas in the province, in the country, in Turtle Island. But it's going to be different from person to person. And the really beautiful thing is that everybody can cultivate a relationship. And that is definitely between you, the land, and creation. So that's what I'm hoping in this program, that we can start to open up these spaces, have these conversations, and really dive into, what, and starting to help people formulate, what is it? What does that mean to me? Just taking it one step further past the land acknowledgement. Not that it's not important, but why is it important? And why it's important. Another goal of this program is going to be a lot of the truth telling. One of the things that's been kind of acknowledged is, and what we do, and we don't necessarily do it from a negative place. What we're doing is we're trying to make decisions in walking this path from a perspective of a time in the process that we've never actually done before. And I think that's really important to acknowledge. Yes, we have a lot of founding documentation. Yes, we have a lot of original instructions and agreements that were made amongst the original inhabitants, the indigenous nations, but then also the settlers, the first wave of settlers, the second wave of settlers. We had agreements and we had understandings, but of course, we have this piece of history that we have to do a deep dive into and to reflect on to kind of understand how we've gotten to this place. But in terms of reconciliation as an action, it's something we've never did. We are the first ones doing it. It's never been done before. We've never been in this space and time. So I really want to take that time to recognize that, we're all coming to this with very unique perspectives. We're all coming to this with very unique experiences of this now modern, this now contemporary space that we're all occupying and interacting with one another. So, one of the things that's going to help us in terms of, really understanding is that truth telling piece and listening to all of those perspectives. So it's very well documented and known that one of the things that's been kind of left out from a lot of the history is the Indigenous side of history. And that's not just what's going on now and what kind of has gone on in the last, couple thousand years. What we're going to do in this session and these sessions is actually going to talk and do deep dives around some of the knowledge that came before that, right? Because there's a wealth of information, there's a wealth of knowledge that's out there that doesn't actually ever have many opportunities for it to be heard in this way. So I really wanted to take the time to acknowledge even Northric Arts for wanting to have these conversations and to open it up to dialogue. And it's a really profound process, and it is a process. That's the other piece of this, is it's not a one-time thing. This is something that is going to add to your repertoire of knowledge that you can carry, and every single individual participant can carry forward in helping them to navigate this time, the reconciliation times, but also how to continue to foster and develop their connection to land and to water and to creation. Because that's one of the ways that we're going to strengthen our connections to ourselves, but also our connection to each other. And that's really the root of the relationship building. So I'm going to fast forward real quick here. To the program goals and code. I had that at the end, but sometimes I do that. You'll notice that when I present, I go with the flow of what needs to be said when it needs to be said. So I'm really feeling called to kind of talk about these program goals and the code. Now, the reason why I have this kind of put up here is I think it's really important for us to, again, ground our time together and how we're going to be operating and moving forward in a respectful place. And as in a sometimes somewhat challenging space too. I'm not going to deny that. Some of these conversations that we're going to have may be the first time that some people are hearing these things, and they may be, I don't, for myself, again, and this may just be my social work training and public speaking, but one of the things, like, oftentimes when we go into these spaces, we start talking about history. A lot of people like to put on like cautions, right? And some people call them like trigger warnings and things like that. I don't do that. I don't want to do that because you really don't know. You can't gauge what's going to, how something's going to hit, and how someone's going to deal with it. But I want everybody on this call and anybody who's watching the recording afterwards to understand that I myself, I recognize moving into this space and taking on these projects, at least in my own responsibility of doing this work, I always do so in a very intentional way in making myself available. Should something, maybe something will not necessarily um, be an issue for someone if they first time they hear it, but it could be, and I've had this happen before where in other presentations where something I say in terms of sharing information may end up kind of traveling and then having an effect on somebody a week later. So I really want to, be sure to have the understanding with the group and people watching this that I'm always available to listen and to support because that is my own personal, duty and my own personal commitment to these projects and to this type of work is to make sure that I'm available to have these conversations should the need be there and the desire. And for myself, I've been doing this work for quite a bit of time, having these conversations with a lot of different people for quite a bit of years. So there's not much I haven't heard. And I like to think that I'm a pretty open person. And one of the things I found over time of talking about these different issues and then, sharing teachings and creating these types of spaces, very intentional spaces, is it's always good to have a general understanding, a code of how we're going to conduct ourselves. And one of the things that I bring forward are, and that's what I'm listing here, anything that I would ask of participants, I would never ask of them if I can't ask of it for myself. So I want everybody to know that equally goes for myself as much as it goes for everybody else that's in the circle. And that's how we start to create these, safer spaces that are aiming for safety, for us to all kind of come and be comfortable in these spaces. So with the code, I'm asking for when we're really rooting and grounding this information in the sessions is for mutual respect for everybody in the circle. That includes understanding that everybody, like I said, comes with their own unique paths and their own unique history, their own unique experiences, and there's none better than the other. It's just different, and that's a part of the reconciliation work is understanding our differences so that we can be stronger as a unit and moving forward. And the other part here is around reciprocity. The piece that I want to really put forward for people to understand is that it's taken a lot for Indigenous peoples to get to this point where we are starting to move into different spaces and to have more people wanting to listen. So it's a process for us just as much as it is for everybody else. And one of the things that I've found in my own experience is the need to really establish reciprocity in the beginning. Because what sometimes will happen is a lot of people like to look at the pretty things, right? We have beautiful dances, we have beautiful ceremonies, we have all these really, really rich cultural pieces. But we also have a lot of, things that we need to work through in terms of healing. We have a lot of truths that need to be acknowledged as well as those things. So it's really about the reciprocity of not only wanting to look at and take in the shiny, but also taking in some of the shadow. So that is something, and of course, as I mentioned, I'm here, and that's one of the pieces of my role that I see is to be able to support people through that process, should there be any questions, right? The other piece here is open-mindedness is extremely important when we're talking about reconciliation and different topics. And because again, the reason why we're even in this space to start having these conversations is due to openness. And if we think about the first contact was not necessarily a bad thing, in that there was a sense of open-mindedness, there was a welcoming. So I'm really imploring people to kind of think about that original anchor in history of how we originally came to interact with one another, and kind of keep that in our spirits and keep that in our energy as we're going through this process of sharing some of these information. And then the other piece here is gratitude, which I've already kind of said is that, having the gratitude for having this space, for having the opportunity. I'm just as grateful to have, you know, the participants that are on this call and the people that are going to listen to this recording and want to learn more. I'm beyond grateful for the fact that, you know, people are that you're showing up, right? That says something. It's a very big action. It's a very heartwarming thing, actually, when you really look at it. And I'm grateful for that. And again, if we go back to the code, go up to the top, reciprocity, returning the gratitude is only going to foster more gratitude and is only going to foster more joy and openness. So it's only going to bring positive things for us. And the other piece here is compassion. The reason why I have this on here is for a lot of different reasons. Compassion is of course great to have for everybody, for as much as you can, but especially for Indigenous knowledge sharing. You know, and as you're starting to move into this, if this is the first time that you're kind of moving into the space of trying to deep dive into reconciliation and what it means, is an understanding that I am hoping to get across to people in that. You know, compassion is one of those very undervalued skills and allowances you could give somebody, and especially outside of this group as well. And the reason why I say that is that there's a recognition I want to make in that, you know, not all of our community members are finding themselves in the space and the readiness as, say, I am, to have these conversations. And that's 100% okay. Compassion to me is really about acknowledging and honoring where somebody is on their journey, and not expecting any more, any less. It's really about acceptance of where they're at. And again, always going back to reciprocity, that goes both ways. And that's really how we're going to get the most out of what we're talking about here, and to really foster and develop and strengthen relationship. And re-strengthen, I would say, because we did have a strong relationship at one point in history. And the last piece here I have is ignorance versus arrogance. So one of the things I found doing this work is I really appreciate ignorance. I don't appreciate arrogance, because, and it's not necessarily that I don't understand arrogance. I definitely understand where it comes from, because sometimes where that really, the root of that is usually is fear and misunderstanding or not understanding something. And, you know, the fear piece around not wanting to ask clarification and instead kind of going off of what's the most comfortable, which is, again, going back to that open-mindedness and that compassion piece, is not necessarily to blame anybody for the reactions. So, however, I also recognize and honor my own spirit and the resiliency of my ancestors. And some of the things that I work on a day-to-day basis is having healthy boundaries. And boundaries are really what helps us to honor ourselves and to protect our spirits. So, to myself, like I pride myself in being a very compassionate person to a point, and that point is when it starts to invade my spirit. And sometimes arrogance can be like that. But what's the best way to, as the anecdote to arrogance, is ignorance. You know, willful ignorance is a very, very handy tool. It's a great method when you're having conversations about reconciliation. I've found over time, and I've had the best conversations with individuals who have just been, you know, willing to admit, you know, I may be ignorant to this part, but I'm really curious about, you know, why you smudge, right? I just am curious about it, but I don't know anything about it. And, you know, apologies, I'm not meaning to offend, but I literally don't know. And that's okay. And those, I'm, you know, from my experience, those have been the best openings of conversation and have been really, really beautiful in terms of knowledge exchange. So that's why I wanted to go through this code with you, to really anchor kind of, you know, how we're going to spend our time together. And again, just of course, always remembering the reciprocity piece in that, you know, what I give, you know, I'm hoping to also be open to receiving from, you know, the participants and vice versa, and how we're sharing this space. So the other piece here is going through reconciliation just to give an understanding and a little bit more in depth of what it is and what it is not. So for me, in my experience, reconciliation really is first and foremost that truth-telling piece, and followed by the listening, um, and then going through and the openness to learning all history. There's a lot of teachings that I've been given over time, and one of the teachings is about truth, and essentially that truth. People like to think that there's one side and then there's another side, but sometimes people forget that real truth is what resides in the middle, and the middle is actually the cumulation of what has happened from all angles, and that's where the truth really resides, is down the middle, which also has a lot of connotations and connections to our eagle feathers and different things like that and symbols. Um, but I wanted to really bring that back to understanding that the truth telling is really really important to the process. And again, I already talked about the ignorance over arrogance, the striving for inclusivity and equity. That ultimately is what reconciliation to me is all about, and reconciliation activations and projects and these kinds of sessions. It's really about that striving for inclusivity, because even to an extent of including the inclusivity of history, because um, we've spent a lot of time where there's been voices left out, or different parts left out, and whether that be intentional or not, people can debate that if they'd like. I have my own opinions about that, but ultimately, one of the ways that we're going to actually start to create some change is by, again, acknowledging all of the voices that are coming to the table. Another piece of this that reconciliation is the recognition of sovereignty, and we'll get into that when we start to talk about treaties and we start to talk about some of the history. Honoring boundaries, and I kind of talked a little bit about that around what how that kind of comes into play. Honoring where people are at and what people are comfortable talking about. You'll learn through this time spent with me that I'm a very open book. But again, I've done a lot of work to be able to get to this place to have these types of conversations, and not everybody is there. So it's really about honoring where people are at and their path. Acknowledging privilege, that's something that we're going to learn through this process as well. Reconciliation is definitely includes that piece around acknowledging that, and also acknowledging that privilege is what it is, it's privilege, but also that it actually can contribute to these conversations in some very meaningful ways, which we'll get to in this program as well. And another piece that reconciliation is that a lot of people don't want or don't necessarily think to talk about is the processing of grief and loss. And that is something that I've definitely seen over and over again of all the years I've been doing this work, is the implication and the impact of grief and loss. If this is the first time you're hearing some of these stories and some of the history, it can be very jolting to the system, because again, it's that gloss over of a whole era of information that essentially is kept from us, right? Even for myself, everything that I know about my own history is taken of my own volition. It's from my own initiation. I did not learn it in schools. A lot of it was very hidden from myself and my peers as I grew up and was in post-secondary. Even that was some of the first time I started learning about these things. So even for myself, there's a lot of grief and there's a lot of loss that is involved in that, and processing the fact that essentially what we're dealing with is being lied to. So that's the first thing that oftentimes in this process has to be reconciled with, is the fact that we are facing a reality that we have not seen or are seeing in the first time ever. And I honor the grief and loss of my own community, but I also honor the grief and loss that comes for every single person that starts to take on reconciliation work for themselves, for their communities, and beyond that. And then the last is allyship, or not last, but this next one is allyship. All of these things combined will contribute to a solid foundation of allyship, which we will talk about. And the last piece here is that really, really important is that it's an ongoing process. It's something that once you start, you can stop. Everybody has choice and free will. But it's one of those things that, in order for it to be successful, for us to make some progress here, it's an action, right? It's an action, and an action really is what's going to follow the words. So it's an ongoing process. It's a learning process. It's something that we're going to be undertaking for quite a bit of time. It's definitely not going away. So it's something that we need to start exploring and really starting to understand for ourselves how we contribute to that process, or do we? So reconciliation is not, and I think this is important to make the distinction. And I've kind of touched on a few of these things, but I'll go through them real quick. So reconciliation is not shaming or survivor blaming. Again, this is just a recognition of the complex histories and honoring where people are at in their paths. Everybody's at a different place, and some people may react to conversations of reconciliation in different ways, and that's completely okay. It's really, up to us to honor where everybody is at. And some people, even on the flip side of it, may not want to participate in the conversation. And, as much as we can try to encourage, again, it's never about pushing anybody past what they want to do or what they want to be involved in. But we can definitely keep the invitation open and keep a spot in the circle. So it's also not reinforcing stereotypes and romanticism or fetishization. That's really important, because stereotypes and the romanticism, especially the fetishization, I do a whole session that's just a training session just on that connection to that process and violence against women and Indigenous women, particularly in the MMIWG movement. But these types of actions are very harmful, and they may not seem so on the surface, but they definitely have caused a big impact to many communities. So it's important to keep that in our minds, that it's not about reinforcing the negative qualities of kind of what's been out there in terms of the stereotyping. And it is also not performative action. A lot of times you might see, again, with the land acknowledgements, kind of using it as a checkbox. We've done our duty for, this or that program. And to an extent, it's something, right? It's a action that's, still causing some change. But I think it's important to acknowledge that a lot of community members, a lot of nations, a lot of Indigenous people are past that point now. And now we're really looking for the action, right? Following up the words, moving past the land acknowledgement, and deepening that understanding. I talked about the checkbox and approval. Invalidating trauma or history, that kind of goes along with the reinforcing of the stereotypes and the shaming and survivor blaming. Again, same thing with the ends at a land acknowledgement. Just an Indigenous issue. It's definitely not just an Indigenous issue, and that's something I've heard over and over again over the years as I've done this work. It's kind of that that general understanding of, or that general position of, of course the history is murky, and there's a sense of shame and guilt that comes along with that from outside of the Indigenous communities, which oftentimes I've heard of, which is the my ancestors didn't do it, or like my grandparents didn't do it, my family wasn't involved in it, so why do I have to be a participant in this? The reason, and ultimately, is the last line here, which we're going to talk about in the next two sessions, is that the reality of it is if you reside in Canada, any place and land in Canada, you are a treaty person. We're all treaty people, and we all have responsibility that's been laid out in those treaties, not just about commerce, not just about occupation. It goes deeper than that. It's really comes down to stewardship and responsibility to the land, but also ultimately what that translates to is the responsibility to one another for our survival. Because there's a very deep intricacy between the land and our livelihood and our ability to continue to walk an earth walk, to be here and doing what we're doing. Okay, so now that I've kind of laid the groundwork of what we're doing here, we're going to start with the introductory session with a bit of groundwork and some truth telling. And so really the way that I want to do this is to go through a very, very as brief as I can. It's a pretty complicated history, and it's also very high level. I want people to understand that, again, every nation of people, Indigenous peoples, have their own unique history. What I'm focusing on is kind of the bigger political implications and policy that have had the biggest impact on many Indigenous nations in Canada. So I'm going to give you a brief history of some of the reasons of, like, how did we get here, right? Why is reconciliation even a conversation? Why are we in this position of having to reconcile? What do we have to reconcile? So I'm going to move through here and talk about some really key policy issues that some of them continue to affect our communities today. So, timeline of our relationship. So, as I mentioned, we had first contact. So, Indigenous nations and peoples, we've been residing on Turtle Island, which is North America, comprising of the now US and Canada, and to an extent Mexico and some of the Isles. And we had been residing here for, time immemorial, like thousands and thousands and thousands of years prior to first contact. And you can go into some of the deep history, nation to nation, that will have some of the original stories, which are just fascinating and amazing. If you're ever interested and want to spend time knowing some of that history. But primarily, the first contact, from many different accounts, actually was not a disruption, in the sense that many of the Indigenous nations had actually made peace treaties or had been welcoming to newcomers coming into the land base and helping them with their survival, because we have to remember that Indigenous people, being here for as long as they had, we knew a thing or two of how to live and how to survive. The terrain was very different from where people were coming from, which was predominantly around Europe, predominantly the Dutch, the French, the English. And so I just want to have that baseline there, that first initial contact not necessarily being a negative thing. And as this was happening, they had missionaries going back and forth, surveying the land, going back and doing reports, and really reporting that, wow, there was this vast land base, predominantly to their view, unoccupied. So that's when the expansion started to increase and more people coming over. But there was a recognition that there was not necessarily a agreement to the flooding and the influx of settlers coming and occupying land. So the original missionaries and explorers kind of documented and noted that was going to potentially be an issue. So one of the solutions to that became the doctrine of discovery, which had been implemented in other colonies. You can actually trace that back to places like Africa, had a very similar process that happened in terms of colonization, and many, many, many other nations around the world. So basically, it was the implementation of the doctrine of discovery originating in the 1400s, which essentially is an agreement or a statement issued by the Pope that clarifying and defining the land is underutilized, and due to the underutilization, really reinforcing savagery to justify the disposition of the nations within the land base. So that began in the 1600s. Moving into this, we're talking another 1,000 years, 1700s, or 100, sorry, 100, 1700s, moving into the Indigenous resistance to settlements, as I was mentioning, that became really heightened. And then from there was the implementation of the Royal Proclamation, which is essentially the British assuming dominance of the land, of being able to make the decisions for what happens with it. And then the original, that was where we first started to see the intention to extinguish Indigenous title to land, and really trying to take them out of bargaining rights, as was seen as by the British and by European colonies. And then moving into the 1800s, that's when we start to see treaty making taking on a new form. Distinctions are made in recognizing that the treaties are living documents. So this is a really key point in history, in that this is what a lot of our land claims are based on today, is the fact that a lot of these agreements that were made between Indigenous nations, sovereign Indigenous nations, and the Crown, or different European nations, was this idea that the treaties were one-off contracts, that basically kind of like one and done deal. You've made an agreement that you're kind of giving this for this, and that's not how Indigenous nations actually interpret treaties. And there's a whole history behind how Indigenous treaty making really contributed to the how that relationship broke down, which we're going to talk about in the next two sessions. But essentially, there's a disconnect between the interpretation of treaty as it's seen from Indigenous nations, and the interpretation of treaty as it's seen from European colonies. Whoops. Okay, so from here, what I have here is just a little symbol that kind of shows an illustration showing the breakdown of relationship. And I'm showing you this to kind of keep it in mind as we're moving along the timeline. So one of the things that happened when settlers first came in, we have to remember that there's an immediate clash of worldview that's happening. The way that the governance structure is set up for European colonies is very different from Indigenous nations. And again, because Indigenous nations are so diverse, they're going to be different from nation to nation. But the predominant structure is similar. And in that when they came, seeing the structure and the makeup of the community, and one of those pieces being that, that strength and the connection to culture, to ceremony, to a really different way of life and living in terms of a spiritual nature. And so the way that our communities were constructed, most of them, I'm not saying all, but most of them, is with the bundle, which is everything that involved, including in the bundle, is the culture, is the ceremony, is the dance, is the way that we hunt, the practices of marriage, like all these types of things that kind of are like the foundational workings of the community. That is all the bundle. And with that bundle, we always place the children next to it, so that we can continue to strengthen our connections, so that we have longevity. It's a way of succession planning, essentially, to continue those really continue the teachings, and keep our communities thriving. And around that, we have the women and the elders. The women, of course, for helping support and taking care of the children, but we also wanted the elders there to be able to pass down that knowledge to the children. So they're always maintained, within that circle, closer to the center. And then after that, we have the men, and them being kind of not outside of the community, but in a protective space around ensuring the safety of the women, the elders, and the children, and the safety of the bundle. And then that contributing to the nation and the treaty that kind of encompasses the community. And that's how we relate from community to community, is with our nation's protocol, our nation's agreements, our instructions, and the treaty. So 1876, we see the introduction of the Indian Act, and this is based primarily because there's a lot of pushback from Indigenous communities. Basically, you wanting to, not having, losing their land base, losing their access to food, to hunting grounds, different things like that. So really feeling the pressure from the incoming settlers and the European colonies And so as a part of this, there was legislation introduced that basically started to put restrictions on Indigenous peoples, so much to as where they were able to occupy and build their villages and have their communities, all the way to forbidding ceremonial practices. So really kind of taking that bundle out of the middle of the community, which is the anchor, as I was just explaining. Um, so that, and with that came limitations on the expression of self-governance and culture, and limiting movement, and then eventually having the reserve system put in place, which is only designating communities to very small areas that were not anywhere near their previous occupation, their previous communities, how they were functions before, and really limiting the space into like a very small area. And the reserve system actually still exists today. And I'm talking to you from one. So that's now what we have left in most areas is the reserve lands. And then we also have the unceded crown lands that we'll talk about as well in the treaty talks. So moving into, again, continued resistance, we're moving now from the 1800s to the 1900s. Then with the reserve system, there was the creation of the council system, which starts to regulate our farming, starts to dictate enfranchisement, which is a process of eliminating an individual's right to title as an Indigenous person. So for example, if an Indigenous woman decided to marry a non-Indigenous man, she would immediately lose her status and she would lose her connection to her community, essentially giving up her Indigenous identity and becoming a Canadian citizen. Similarly, if men wanted to join in war efforts to support whatever side in fighting for territory, one of the stipulations and parts of enfranchisement was in some areas to take away title if you were wanting to participate in war. And part of this pushback as well is that ceremonies continued, and the rebellions actually ensued. There's a couple notable ones, primarily in the prairie provinces, and there's really this big push in terms of other nations kind of gathering together to fight back against the European colonies in the area. And then due to this resistance, we see the government of Canada create the now government of Canada as established and enforced upon Indigenous nations is the creation of Indian agents, and then also the creation of the residential school system that came after that. Indian agents essentially are people hired by the government to reside on reserve that are not non-Indigenous most times, that basically governed, how people moved around the territory. They governed if you could leave the reserve or if you could come back, what you were doing. They governed the food that came in, the food that went out. So really having a restriction on like somebody watching every single thing that you're doing and prosecuting those who are not falling in line, because the resistance had gotten that big. And then the residential school system, that's something that we're seeing in the news recently, is the recovery of children who had attended the schools, the recovery of their bodies that's happening. And that's something that's a recent thing, but it's definitely not something that is unknown to Indigenous communities. We've known that for quite a bit of time. It's only just that this is, I guess, in a sense, validating survivor stories about what had actually happened at these schools, and really, legitimizing the concern and what people have been saying about residential school systems and the original intention of it. So that's what's happening now. And that goes all the way back to, the 1800s, 1900s, the last residential school system, or the last residential school then closing in 1996, I believe it is. I could be wrong. I think it's 1996, 1997. It's one of those two. And so that is a really, really big piece of history to think about in terms of ourselves. How do we bring that back to the present day? Present day, yes, we're recovering. We're recovering our children, but also often think in my own process, I'm 35. I was born in 1986, and I could have went to one of them. That's how close it is to my generation of, the existence of the schools. And yeah, so that's kind of where we're heading in terms of the timeline. Now we're moving into the mid 1950s, 1960s. This is a big era that a lot of people talk about in terms of Indigenous issues and resistance and different issues dealing with currently is the 60s scoop, which essentially was, uh, different policies and processes that were implemented by the child welfare system in order to take children away from Indigenous families and place them with non-Indigenous families. And many times when children were placed in different families, with that came another route of enfranchisement, of taking away their connection to their community by taking away their status and basically registering them as not being Indigenous anymore. So that's something that's happened to a lot of different people. And, there's a lot of class actions that have happened over the years of trying to, rectify that and then also reconnect people with their families and their communities. And that still happens today. So we're still dealing with the impact of these policies. So moving into the 1969, the white paper is introduced. It's formally known as the Statement of the Government of Canada on Indian Policy in 1969. It's a policy paper that basically attempted to abolish documents relating to, different pieces around trying to implement the Indian Act. And it actually was led and proposed by John Chrétien, which was then the Minister of Indian Affairs and Northern Development, and the then Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau. So the reason why I'm bringing this up is that there's a connection here that we need to start looking at things critically. So of course there's already some resistance and there's some distrust if we're looking at the history alone. And the fact of the matter is we have a prime minister in now who is the son of Pierre Elliott Trudeau. So if we're talking about, looking at reconciliation acts, what does that type of, it may not necessarily be overtly on purpose, but, you have to start and think of from that compassionate place. If you're having someone that has a legacy connected to trying to implement and abolish Indigenous rights and Indigenous identity in Canada, what does that do for the community in terms of, having that kind of rehashed and brought up again, just by the connection to a politician that actually was trying to put forward some of these policies. Moving on, we have the 1970s, 1980s. That's when you started to really see the Red Power movement. Now, I wasn't alive yet, but I definitely have followed, a lot of the advocates and community activists that were involved in that movement, and they really did do a lot of really amazing work. I wouldn't be able to be here to be talking to you if it wasn't for the demonstrating and, the pushback and the resistance that was put forward by people and members of that movement. But essentially what it is it's an awareness that started to ripple across the country that was trying to bring awareness to treaty relations and the sovereignty rights that Indigenous nations have. And it also was one of the driving forces in reforms to the Indian Act that occurred just shortly after that, which is Bill C-31, which is essentially eliminating a sexist provision, which is what I had mentioned to you about if an Indigenous woman married a non-Indigenous man, she would lose her title. And that actually, that amendment, from what I understand, because I have a connection to that in the sense that that was passed the year that I was born. So again, bringing it back to personal experience, that's something that I very well could have had to have dealt with in my time if it wasn't for some of these, some of our ancestors and some of our community members that were really pushing for, bringing a halt to some of the most damaging pieces of the policies. And then moving forward in 1996 is the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, and established in 1991, but it was the aim of investigating the relationship between Indigenous people and Canada. And predominantly that was because of the Red Power movement. It started to spark demonstrations similar to what we would have seen recently with Idle No More. But it actually resulted in a lot of ongoing violence perpetuated between the state and Indigenous peoples, and actually had resulted in some deaths of Indigenous people, basically fighting for their right to their land base of that little that they had left, that was involved in the reserve system and the unceded territory. And the government essentially is finally recognizing in 1996 that there's an issue here that we need to have resolved, and start looking at this more deeply, and starting to try to find some type of working relationship. 2000s to the present day, there's a lot of talk recently, if it's something of interest to people, if you want to know what's kind of driving some of the current issues, what we have here now is a lot of push to recognize the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, otherwise known as UNDRIP. And that primarily is focused on acknowledging Indigenous nations' right to self-determination and sovereignty. And really, that language is a lot to do and fuel the conversations that people are having around land back. And really, ultimately, that's the root of it, is this idea of sovereignty, and that we are sovereign nations and we need to be recognized as such, because that's who made the original treaties of Canada. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada Calls to Action, which was essentially a lengthy report comprised as a response to residential school survivors and their experience in residential school systems, and basically calls to action around how to essentially make sure that we don't ever have this happen in our country and to our people again, is to honor the voices, honor the stories, but also honor the history and recognize that we need to never forget what actually happened, so that we don't repeat mistakes. And moving into more recently, and this really coincides with a lot of the work that I currently do, which is the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Calls for Justice, that was released recently, well, not recently now, but it was a few years back, but that's a very lengthy report that talks about the systemic connections to colonialism and violence against women, and ongoing systemic oppression, and things that we need to kind of look again, calls for justice around how we fix this. So these things, again, they're lengthy, but if you're interested in knowing kind of where we're rooted in present day, that's a really great place to start. And I think the last piece that I want to get across to everybody when it comes to history is that the Indian Act is a piece of legislation that basically governs everything that we do, down to who can own property, who can take up agriculture, how your status and your rights, like your right to healthcare, how you access those things, what your marriage looks like all of these things are all in there. It's a very lengthy document, a piece of legislation. And what's important to know about it is that it's still enacted. I have a card in my wallet that I carry around that basically is a document that was recognized, is the government recognizing me as an Indigenous person, and that it's recognizing that I have rights, as it is resolving in terms of nation and nation right. But that the document itself and the legislation is very problematic in many fronts, but we're still governed by it. We still have that imposed on us to this day. So that's just a really brief history of where we're at and where we're going to deep dive into more of in this program. But past that, past the history, it's not that the history is not important, but what we're going to actually get to as well is, what did we have before? What are the ethics? What's the code? What was our understanding of the relationship, and how was that? What is that founding understanding of relationship that Indigenous nations are bringing to the table when it comes to treaty? Because that's really how we're going to understand how we move forward and how we actually have a working relationship in stewarding the land. It's not about ownership, right? It's about stewarding. How are we going to live together harmoniously, cooperatively, for everyone's good, and really ensure our survival as people, because ultimately that's what it's going to be really about as we move through this program. So I'm going to stop sharing here. That is the overview for the program. So I know that was a lot of information and I tried to move through like as quick as I could, but and again, you could spend lots and lots of time really deep diving into every single part of that history. And over the next couple of days, we have Jason Mercredi coming in to talk about treaty specifically. He's a good friend of mine, but also furthermore, he is really versed in treaty law, and he has a lot of experience working with Indigenous communities around how we restore treaty and stewardship in communities and working with government. So yeah, miigwech now.
Thank you, Lindsay, so much.